The blood pooled in the grooves between the wooden floorboards, dark and sticky in the dim lamplight of the kitchen. And Adelaide Evans scrubbed harder, her knuckles white around the rough bristles of the brush. The stranger had been dead before he hit the ground, his body now wrapped in canvas and hidden in the root cellar until she could figure out what to do with it. And her hands shook as she worked the lye soap into the stain that kept spreading no matter how hard she tried to contain it. The August heat of Apache Junction, Arizona made everything worse in 1883. The air thick and suffocating even at midnight, sweat dripping down her temples as she worked in frantic silence. She did not hear the footsteps on her porch until the knock came, 3 sharp raps that made her freeze with the scrub brush still pressed against the floor. Adelaide looked up, her heart hammering against her ribs, dark hair falling loose from its pins to frame her pale face. She was 23 years old and had been a widow for 6 months, living alone in this small house on the edge of town, where the respectable folks rarely ventured. The knock came again, more insistent this time, and she slowly rose to her feet, wiping her reddened hands on her apron without thinking. Through the window she could see the silhouette of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his hat casting his face in shadow. "Madam, I saw your lamp burning," the voice called through the door, deep and rough but not unkind. "My horse threw a shoe about a mile back. I was hoping I might trouble you for some water while I walk him into town come morning." Adelaide's mind raced. She could not let him in, not with the blood still wet on her floor, not with a body in her cellar. But she could not send him away either, not without raising suspicion. In Apache Junction, folks remembered when you turned away a traveler in need, and she could not afford more gossip than she already endured. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door handle, then stopped. She looked back at the floor, at the damning evidence of what had happened tonight, and made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. She opened the door just wide enough to see him properly. He was older than her by perhaps 5 years, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of storm clouds. Dust covered his clothes, and his face showed the weathered tan of a man who spent his days under the desert sun. He held his hat in his hands, polite despite his obvious exhaustion. "I appreciate the offer, but I am in the middle of something," Adelaide said, her voice steadier than she felt. "There is a trough around back with fresh water for your horse. You can bed down in the stable if you need shelter." The cowboy's eyes drifted past her shoulder, just for a moment, and she knew he had seen something. The lamplight, the bucket of pink water, perhaps even the edge of the stain she had been working so desperately to remove. His expression did not change, but something shifted in the way he looked at her, a calculation happening behind those gray eyes. "That is mighty kind, madam," he said slowly, "but I could not help noticing you have got a difficult job in there. Sometimes fresh blood requires salt and cold water, not lye. Lye sets the stain if it has already started to dry." Adelaide felt the world tilt sideways. She gripped the door frame, uncertain whether to slam the door in his face or collapse entirely. He knew. Of course he knew. But he stood there calm as Sunday morning, waiting for her to make the next move. "I did not ask for help," she whispered. "No, madam, you did not." He shifted his weight, glancing over his shoulder at the dark street behind him. "But it seems to me you might need it anyway. Name is Xander Sinclair. I have cleaned up my share of messes in my time. I am not here to judge or ask questions, just offering a hand if you want it." She should have sent him away. Every rational thought in her head screamed at her to close the door and take her chances alone. But Adelaide had been alone for so long, carrying so many burdens by herself, and the genuine lack of judgment in this stranger's face cracked something open inside her chest. She stepped back and let him in. Xander entered slowly, removing his spurs and setting them quietly by the door as though he visited at a civilized hour, instead of creeping into a widow's house past midnight. He assessed the kitchen with the practiced eye of someone who had seen violence before, taking in the bucket, the scrub brush, the spreading stain that Adelaide had been fighting for the past hour. He said nothing about the obvious implications, just rolled up his sleeves and knelt beside the stain. "You have salt?" he asked. Adelaide nodded mutely and retrieved the salt box from the shelf. Her hand still shook as she handed it to him, and he noticed but did not comment. Instead, he dumped a generous amount onto the bloodstain and used the scrub brush to work it into the wood with firm, circular motions. The salt began to absorb the blood, turning pink and then dark red as he worked. "Cold water now," he said quietly. "We will need several buckets. This will take some time." They worked in silence, Adelaide drawing water from the well out back while Xander methodically cleaned the floor. Each time she returned with a fresh bucket, she found him focused entirely on the task, his movements efficient and sure. He did not look at her with suspicion or fear. He did not demand explanations. He simply cleaned as though helping a stranger dispose of evidence in the dead of night was the most natural thing in the world. An hour passed, then two. The stain gradually faded from black to brown to a pale shadow in the wood grain. Xander worked without complaint, his shirt soaked through with sweat in the oppressive heat, his hands raw from the scrubbing. Adelaide found herself watching him, this strange cowboy who had appeared on her doorstep like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to voice. "Why are you helping me?" she finally asked as the sky outside began to lighten toward dawn. "You do not know what happened here. You do not know if I deserve help." Xander sat back on his heels, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked up at her with those storm-gray eyes, and for the first time that night, he smiled. It was a tired smile, sad around the edges but genuine. "I figure if you were the kind of person who did not deserve help, you would not have looked so terrified when I showed up," he said. "Bad people do not usually scrub their own floors at midnight with tears running down their faces. They pay someone else to clean up their messes." He paused, studying her face in the growing light. "Whatever happened here tonight, I am guessing it was not your choice. And I have learned that sometimes the best thing a man can do is help someone who needs it and keep his mouth shut about the details." Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes again, but she blinked them back. She had not let herself cry properly since her husband died, since the whole town had looked at her with varying degrees of pity and suspicion, since she had learned exactly how alone a woman could be even when surrounded by people. This stranger's kindness felt like water in the desert, and she did not trust herself to speak without breaking down entirely. "The stain is mostly gone," Xander said, turning back to examine his work. "By tomorrow, it will be hard to spot if you know what you are looking for. You will want to move a rug over it, maybe shift your table a bit, make it look natural." "There is still the matter of the body," Adelaide said, her voice barely above a whisper. Xander nodded slowly. "I figured there might be. You want my help with that too." She looked at him, this cowboy named Xander Sinclair, who had stumbled into her nightmare and offered assistance without judgment or question. She thought about the dead man in her cellar, the way he had broken into her house with whiskey on his breath and violence in his eyes, the way she had grabbed the cast iron skillet and swung it with all her strength when he tried to grab her. She thought about how the law would see it, a widow alone with a dead man in her house, never mind that he had attacked her first. Women like her did not get the benefit of doubt in towns like Apache Junction. "Yes," she said finally. "Yes, I need help." They buried him in the desert as the sun rose over the Superstition Mountains. far enough from town that no one would stumble across the grave by accident. Xander dug in silence while Adelaide kept watch, both of them moving with the urgency of people who understood that discovery meant ruin. When the hole was deep enough, Xander climbed out and helped Adelaide lower the canvas-wrapped body into the earth. They covered it quickly, then scattered rocks and brush over the disturbed ground until it looked like every other patch of desert surrounding it. "You should know his name," Xander said as they walked back toward town, leading his lame horse between them. "Tom Bradley. He rode with a gang that operates out of Tucson, running guns and rustling cattle, had a bounty on his head for killing a sheriff's deputy 6 months back." Adelaide stopped walking. "How do you know that?" "I am a bounty hunter," Xander said simply. "Been tracking Bradley for 3 weeks. Lost his trail 2 days ago in the mountains, figured he had headed south into Mexico. I did not expect to find him already dead in a widow's root cellar." He glanced at her sidelong. "You did the territory a favor, Mrs. Evans. That man was dangerous." "Miss Evans," Adelaide corrected automatically. "Or just Adelaide. I was only married 6 months before my husband passed." "Adelaide," Xander repeated, as though testing how her name felt in his mouth. "Pretty name." They walked in silence for a while, the desert morning already growing hot despite the early hour. Adelaide's mind churned with questions and fears, wondering if Xander would turn her in despite his help, wondering if she could trust this stranger who now held her darkest secret in his hands. But when she looked at him, she saw only the same calm steadiness that had convinced her to open her door in the first place. "What happens now?" she asked as they reached the edge of her property. Xander stopped, running his hand along his horse's neck in an absent, soothing gesture. "Now I file a report that I tracked Tom Bradley into the superstitions and lost him in the mountains. Probably crossed into Mexico, beyond my jurisdiction. Case goes cold, bounty stays open, and life goes on." He looked directly at her. "Nothing happens to you. You defended yourself against a wanted criminal. Far as I am concerned, justice got served without bothering the courts. Why would you lie for me? Not lying exactly, just choosing which truths to tell and which to keep private." He shifted his weight, suddenly looking uncomfortable. "Look, Adelaide, I have been hunting bad men for 5 years now. Seen a lot of things in that time, met a lot of people. I have learned to recognize the difference between someone who is dangerous and someone who was forced into a dangerous situation. You are not a killer. You are just someone who survived." The words hit Adelaide harder than she expected, and she had to look away to keep him from seeing her tears. No one had called her a survivor before. They called her a widow, a woman alone, a potential burden or scandal. But survivor, that was different. That implied she had fought for something, won something, instead of just enduring day after day in quiet desperation. "Thank you," she managed to say, "for everything, for helping, for understanding, for not turning me over to the sheriff. You are welcome." Xander tipped his hat to her, then started to lead his horse toward the stable. "I will get my horse settled and be on my way. You should get some rest. You look like you have not slept properly in days." "Wait," Adelaide called out before she could stop herself. He turned back, eyebrows raised in question. "Your horse needs proper shoeing before you can ride out, and the blacksmith does not open until 8. You could stay for breakfast at least. It is the least I can offer after everything." Something flickered in Xander's expression, surprise maybe, or pleasure. "I would not want to impose. You already helped me bury a body. Breakfast hardly seems like an imposition after that." The corner of his mouth lifted in a smile that transformed his whole face, making him look younger and less weathered. "When you put it that way, I suppose I cannot refuse. That would just be rude." Adelaide found herself smiling back, a real smile that felt strange on her face after so many months of practiced politeness and careful neutrality. "Come on, then. I make decent biscuits and I have eggs fresh from this morning." She led him back into her house, the kitchen now clean and innocent looking in the morning light. Adelaide moved through the familiar routine of cooking, grateful for the normalcy of it, while Xander sat at her small table and watched with quiet appreciation. She had not cooked for anyone but herself since her husband died, and she had forgotten how pleasant it could be to prepare a meal for someone who actually wanted to eat it. "So you are a bounty hunter," Adelaide said as she worked lard into flour for biscuits. "That must be dangerous work." "It has its moments," Xander agreed, "but it suits me better than ranching or mining or any of the other work a man can do out here. I like the freedom of it, being able to move from place to place, answer to no one but myself." "You have family, people waiting for you somewhere." Xander shook his head. "My parents died when I was 17. Cholera epidemic back in Missouri. Had a sister, but she married a shopkeeper in Denver 5 years ago. We write occasionally, but she has her own life now. I am mostly on my own, which is how I prefer it." Adelaide cracked eggs into a skillet, the sizzle loud in the quiet kitchen. "That sounds lonely." "Sometimes," he admitted, "but lonely is better than trapped. I saw too many men in Missouri working themselves to death on farms they hated, married to women they barely spoke to, all because that was what they were supposed to do. I wanted something different. And bounty hunting is different in every way that matters." He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "What about you? How did you end up in Apache Junction?" Adelaide hesitated, then decided that after everything they had been through tonight, she owed him at least some honesty. "I was born in Prescott. My father was a clerk, my mother a seamstress. They both wanted me to marry well, settle down, have children. I married Robert Evans when I was 22 because he seemed kind and stable. He owned a small dry goods store here in town. What happened to him? Pneumonia last February. He got sick fast, was dead within a week." Adelaide flipped the eggs with more force than necessary. "Everyone said what a tragedy it was, how sad for me. But the truth is I barely knew my husband. We were married 6 months and I could count on one hand the real conversations we had. He wanted a wife who would cook and clean and not bother him. I wanted someone who actually cared if I had thoughts or feelings." "That does sound lonely," Xander said quietly. It was. Adelaide plated the eggs and biscuits, setting one in front of Xander and keeping one for herself. She sat down across from him, suddenly aware of how intimate this felt, sharing breakfast with a man in her kitchen as the sun rose outside. "After he died, I thought maybe I would feel free like you described, but instead I just felt stuck. His family took the store, said it was not proper for a woman to run a business. I got this house and a small amount of money, enough to live on if I am very careful. But I cannot leave town without people talking, and I cannot stay without feeling like I am suffocating. And last night when Tom Bradley broke in, you fought back," Xander finished. "You survived." "I survived," Adelaide repeated, testing the words like he had tested her name earlier. "I suppose I did." They ate in comfortable silence, the food simple but good. Adelaide found herself studying Xander across the table, noticing details she had missed in the chaos of the night. The scar on his left hand that looked old and well-healed. The careful way he moved, as though always aware of his surroundings. The kindness in his eyes when he looked at her, devoid of the pity or judgment she was so used to seeing. "You should get some rest," Xander said after they finished eating. "I will take care of the dishes, then get my horse to the blacksmith. You have had a long night." "So have you," Adelaide pointed out. "I am used to long nights. You look like you might fall over if someone breathed on you wrong." Adelaide wanted to argue, but exhaustion crashed over her like a wave now that the immediate danger had passed. Her hands ached from scrubbing, her back hurt from digging, and her mind felt fuzzy from fear and adrenaline finally wearing off. She nodded and stood, swaying slightly. Xander was there immediately, his hand on her elbow steadying her. "Easy now. When is the last time you actually slept?" "I do not know," Adelaide admitted. 3 days maybe. I have been having nightmares since Robert died. I tend to avoid sleep when I can." "Well, you cannot avoid it anymore. Go lie down before you collapse. I will make sure no one bothers you." The idea of sleeping while this stranger remained in her house should have frightened her. But Adelaide found she trusted Xander Sinclair more than she had trusted anyone in a very long time. She let him guide her to her bedroom door, then turned to look at him one more time. "Will you still be here when I wake up?" she asked, hating how vulnerable she sounded but needing to know. Xander's expression softened. "If you want me to be, then yes, I will be here." "I want you to be," Adelaide said quietly, then closed the door before she could see his reaction. She fell asleep almost instantly, her body finally giving in to the exhaustion it had been fighting for days. For the first time in months, she did not dream of blood or death or her husband's cold, indifferent face. She dreamed of storm-gray eyes and strong hands helping her carry an impossible burden. When Adelaide woke, the sun was setting outside her window, painting her bedroom in shades of gold and orange. She had slept the entire day away, and for a moment panic seized her as she remembered everything that had happened. But then she heard movement in her kitchen, the clink of dishes and the low sound of someone humming tunelessly, and she relaxed. Xander was still here. He had stayed. Adelaide washed her face and repinned her hair, trying to make herself presentable despite the wrinkled state of her dress and the dark circles she could see under her eyes. When she emerged from her bedroom, she found Xander at her stove stirring something in a pot that smelled surprisingly good. "You cook?" she asked, startling him slightly. Xander turned with a sheepish grin. "Not well, but I can manage basic things. Figured you would be hungry when you woke up, so I made some stew from what you had in your pantry. Hope you do not mind." "I do not mind at all." Adelaide moved closer, peering into the pot. Vegetables and salt pork simmered in a rich-smelling broth. "This looks better than basic. I might have understated my abilities a bit. Man learns to cook pretty well when he is on his own for years at a time." He ladled stew into 2 bowls and carried them to the table, which Adelaide noticed he had already set with her plain dishes and napkins. "Your horse is properly shod, by the way. I picked him up from the blacksmith around noon. Hope it is all right that I used some of the money you had in the jar by the stove. I will pay you back." "You do not need to pay me back. You have done more than enough already." Adelaide sat down, suddenly shy around this man who had invaded her space so thoroughly. "Did anyone ask questions?" "About you being here. The blacksmith asked if I was passing through or planning to stay. I told him I was not sure yet, depended on whether I could find work in the area." Xander took a bite of stew, considering. "He mentioned that the ranch outside town is looking for someone to help with their horses, breaking and training mostly. I used to do that kind of work before I started bounty hunting." Adelaide's heart did something complicated in her chest. "You are thinking of staying, maybe?" "For a while at least." Xander looked at her directly, his gray eyes serious. "Unless you would rather I left, I do not want to make things difficult for you by being around." "No," Adelaide said quickly, then blushed at her own eagerness. "I mean, I would not mind if you stayed. It has been nice having someone to talk to. Someone who does not look at me like I am either a charity case or a potential scandal." "You are neither of those things," Xander said firmly. You are just a woman trying to build a life for herself in a place that does not make that easy." Nothing wrong with that. They ate dinner together as the desert night fell outside, talking about small things and large ones, their pasts and possible futures. Adelaide learned that Xander had wanted to be a veterinarian when he was young, that he loved reading even though books were hard to come by on the trail, that he had once spent 3 months in Mexico tracking a counterfeiter and had learned to speak decent Spanish in the process. Xander learned that Adelaide painted watercolors when she had time and supplies, that she had taught herself to read music from an old book, but had never touched a piano, that she dreamed of someday seeing the ocean even though she had never been farther than Tucson. "You could go," Xander said when she mentioned the ocean. "Nothing stopping you from just leaving if you wanted to. Except money and propriety and the fact that women do not just travel alone across the country on a whim." Adelaide sighed. "Besides, where would I even go? I do not have family or friends outside Arizona. I would just be trading one kind of loneliness for another." "What if you were not alone?" Xander asked, his voice careful. "What if you had someone to travel with?" Adelaide's breath caught. "What are you suggesting?" "I am not sure yet," Xander admitted. "But I know that I have been on my own for a long time, and sitting here with you tonight feels more like home than anywhere I have been in years. And I think maybe you feel something similar, or at least I hope you do." "I do," Adelaide whispered. "But we barely know each other. We met less than 24 hours ago under terrible circumstances. People do not just decide to travel the country together after one night. People do lots of things that do not make sense when you think about them too hard." Xander reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "But sometimes you have to trust your instincts. My instincts tell me that meeting you was not an accident. Maybe I was supposed to lose Tom Bradley's trail. Maybe I was supposed to show up at your door right when you needed help. Maybe this is where I was meant to be all along." Adelaide looked down at their joined hands, feeling the connection between them like a physical thing. She had spent so long being careful, being proper, doing what was expected. And where had it gotten her? Trapped in a loveless marriage, then trapped in widowhood, nearly trapped by a violent criminal in her own kitchen. Maybe it was time to stop being careful and start being brave. "If you stay in Apache Junction, people will talk," she said. "A single man spending time with a widow, it will cause gossip. Let them talk. I have never much cared what people thought of me. It is different for women. Gossip can ruin us. Then we will not give them anything to gossip about." Xander squeezed her hand gently. "I will court you properly if you will let me. Get that job at the ranch. Rent a room at the boarding house. Come calling at appropriate hours with flowers and polite conversation. We will do everything by the book so that even the nosiest busybody in town cannot find fault. And then what? And then we see where this goes. Maybe in a few months we decide we do not suit and go our separate ways. Or maybe we find out that what I am feeling right now, this certainty that I am exactly where I am supposed to be, is something real and lasting. Either way, we give it a chance." Adelaide thought about all the reasons she should say no, should send this cowboy on his way and go back to her quiet, suffocating life. But then she thought about how it had felt to have someone help her without question, to cook breakfast and dinner for someone who appreciated it, to talk about dreams and possibilities instead of just surviving day to day. She thought about storm-gray eyes and strong hands, and the way Xander looked at her like she was someone worth knowing. "All right," she said. "Court me properly, Xander Sinclair. Let us see where this goes." His smile could have lit up the whole desert. The next 6 months passed in a blur of carefully proper courtship and stolen moments of genuine connection. Xander got the job at the Henderson Ranch, working with their horses 6 days a week and earning enough to rent a modest room in town. True to his word, he courted Adelaide with old-fashioned propriety that surprised everyone in Apache Junction, who had expected scandal. He brought her wildflowers picked from the desert, sat on her porch in full view of the neighbors while they talked for hours, escorted her to church on Sundays, even though neither of them was particularly religious. The town gossips watched and waited for something improper to happen, but Adelaide and Xander gave them nothing to work with. They were never alone together without a chaperone, never touched beyond the occasional brush of hands, never gave anyone reason to question their intentions. But in the spaces between propriety, they fell in love. Adelaide learned that Xander was patient with animals but impatient with injustice, that he could spend hours working in silence, but also loved to talk late into the night about philosophy and politics, and whether the new railroad would help or hurt small towns like Apache Junction. She learned that he had nightmares sometimes about the men he had tracked and captured, that he worried he was not good enough for her, that he wanted children someday, but feared he would not know how to be a good father since his own had died when he was so young. Xander learned that Adelaide was stronger than she looked, that she had opinions about everything from women's suffrage to the best way to grow tomatoes in the desert heat, that she laughed like someone who was not used to finding things funny but desperately wanted to. He learned that she sometimes woke at night reliving the moment when Tom Bradley had broken into her house, that she felt guilty for feeling trapped in her marriage even though her husband was dead, that she wanted adventure, but was terrified of leaving the only home she had ever known. They learned each other slowly and thoroughly, building something solid beneath the surface of their proper courtship. And everyone in town could see it, the way they looked at each other when they thought no one was watching, the way they seemed to communicate without words, the way they had somehow become essential to each other in a remarkably short time. In March of 1884, almost exactly a year after Adelaide's first husband had died, Xander asked her to marry him. He did it properly, getting down on one knee in her parlor with her neighbor Mrs. Chen sitting in the corner as chaperone, presenting a simple gold band that he had saved 3 months to afford. Adelaide Evans, you are the bravest, smartest, most fascinating woman I have ever met, Xander said, his voice steady despite the nerves Adelaide could see in his eyes. I know we have not known each other long, and I know some people will say this is too fast or not proper. But I have been on my own my whole adult life, and I do not want to be on my own anymore. I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to hear your opinions on things I have never thought about. I want to help you build the life you deserve instead of just surviving. Will you marry me? Adelaide looked at this man who had appeared in her darkest hour and stayed, who had helped her without judgment, who had courted her with patience and genuine affection. She thought about the life she had been living before he arrived, small and scared and suffocating. Then she thought about the future they could build together, full of possibility and adventure and real partnership. Yes, she said, tears streaming down her face. Yes, Xander, I will marry you, Mrs. Chen clapped her hands in delight, already mentally composing the story she would tell at the mercantile tomorrow. But Adelaide barely noticed. She was too focused on Xander slipping the ring onto her finger, standing up to take her hands in his, looking at her like she was the most precious thing he had ever seen. We could leave if you want, Xander said quietly, after we are married. Go to California, see the ocean like you talked about. I have money saved and I can find work anywhere. We do not have to stay here if it does not make you happy. Maybe someday, Adelaide said, but for now I think I am exactly where I want to be. They married 6 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church on the edge of town. Adelaide wore a dress of pale blue that she had sewn herself, with delicate white flowers in her hair that Xander had insisted on riding 3 hours to Tucson to buy, because Apache Junction did not have a proper florist. The whole town turned out to watch, curious and mostly approving, relieved that the widow Evans had found happiness again with such a respectable young man. If anyone suspected the true circumstances of how Adelaide and Xander had met, they kept their suspicions to themselves. The official story was that Xander had arrived in town looking for work, had met Adelaide by chance, and they had fallen in love like something out of a dime novel. It was close enough to the truth that neither of them felt guilty about the omissions. Their wedding night was spent in Adelaide's house, which was now their house, and it felt simultaneously momentous and natural. Xander was gentle and patient, taking his time to learn what Adelaide liked, whispering how beautiful she was and how lucky he felt. Adelaide discovered that intimacy could be joyful when it was with someone who actually cared about her pleasure, who saw her as a partner instead of a convenience. They made love slowly and thoroughly, learning each other's bodies the way they had learned each other's minds over the past months. Afterward, lying tangled together in the darkness, Adelaide felt a peace she had not known was possible. "I was so scared that night," she whispered against Xander's chest. "When you knocked on my door, I thought my life was over. I thought I would hang for what I had done." "But you opened the door anyway," Xander said, running his fingers through her loose hair. "That took courage, or desperation. Sometimes they are the same thing." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I am glad you opened the door. I am glad I decided to knock instead of just bedding down in your stable. I think about that sometimes, how different things would be if I had made a different choice." "Do you ever regret it, helping me, lying to cover up what happened?" Xander was quiet for a long moment. "No," he finally said. "Tom Bradley was a bad man who died doing a bad thing. The world is better without him in it, and you should not have to suffer for defending yourself. If that makes me a bad bounty hunter or a corrupt lawman, I can live with that. Some things are more important than following rules that were not written with justice in mind." Adelaide tilted her head up to kiss him properly, trying to convey with touch what she could not quite put into words. How grateful she was, how much she loved him, how he had saved her in ways that went far beyond that night in her kitchen. They built a life together in Apache Junction that surprised them both with its happiness. Xander continued working with horses, eventually buying several of his own and starting a small training business on the side. Adelaide began selling her watercolor paintings to travelers passing through town, discovering that people would pay good money for scenes of the desert and mountains rendered in her careful, delicate style. They saved their money carefully, talking late into the night about their dreams. 2 years after they married, Adelaide gave birth to their first child, a son they named Henry after Xander's father. He had Xander's gray eyes and Adelaide's dark hair, and they both fell immediately and completely in love with him. Xander proved to be a natural father despite his fears, patient and playful, teaching Henry to be gentle with animals and curious about the world. When Henry was 3, they had a daughter named Clara, fierce and funny from the moment she was born. And 2 years after that, another son they called James, quiet and thoughtful and utterly adored by his older siblings. They never did make it to California to see the ocean, but somehow it did not matter. They found adventure enough in raising their children, in building their businesses, in creating a home that felt nothing like the lonely, suffocating existence Adelaide had endured before. They found adventure in each other, in conversations that lasted hours, in stolen kisses when the children were asleep, in the 1,000 small ways they chose each other every single day. The town of Apache Junction grew and changed around them. The railroad came through in 1889, bringing new people and new opportunities. The territory moved slowly toward statehood, and with it came new laws and new possibilities for women. Adelaide joined a local suffrage organization and painted signs for their rallies, surprising herself with her own boldness. Xander supported her fully, often watching the children so she could attend meetings, proud of her passion and conviction. They never talked about Tom Bradley or that night in 1883 when Xander had knocked on Adelaide's door and changed both their lives forever. It remained their secret, buried in the desert like the body itself, something they both knew but never needed to revisit. The past was the past, and they were more interested in the present and future they were creating together. Sometimes, though, Adelaide would catch Xander looking at her with an expression of wonder, as though he still could not quite believe his luck. And she would smile because she felt exactly the same way. They had found each other in the darkest of circumstances and chosen to build something beautiful from that darkness. They had taken a moment of violence and fear and transformed it into a foundation for love and family and genuine happiness. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1894, Xander surprised Adelaide with a gift. He had been saving for 2 years without telling her, hiding money away bit by bit, until he had enough. He presented her with tickets to San Francisco, a week away from the children who would stay with Mrs. Chen, a chance to finally see the ocean she had dreamed about all those years ago. Adelaide cried when she saw the tickets, overwhelmed by the gesture and what it represented. That Xander had listened to her dreams and remembered them. That he had worked to make them come true, even though she had stopped talking about the ocean years ago, too busy with the beautiful chaos of their life together. They took the train west in May, watching the landscape change from desert to farmland to forest to coast. When Adelaide finally stood on the beach in San Francisco, feeling the cold spray of the Pacific on her face and hearing the crash of waves against the shore, Xander stood beside her with his arm around her waist. "Was it worth the wait?" he asked. Adelaide leaned into him, breathing in salt air and the familiar scent of her husband. She thought about the girl she had been at 23, trapped and scared and scrubbing blood from her kitchen floor. She thought about the woman she had become, confident and loved and free in all the ways that mattered. "Yes," she said, "everything was worth it to get here." They spent a week in San Francisco, exploring the city like children, eating food they had never tried and seeing sights they had only read about. But they were both happy to return to Apache Junction, to their children and their home and the life they had built. Because as beautiful as the ocean was, it did not compare to what they had together. The years continued to pass, bringing change and challenge and joy in equal measure. Henry grew up to become a veterinarian like his father had once dreamed of being, studying in Tucson and returning to Apache Junction to start his own practice. Clara became a teacher, fierce in her belief that every child deserved an education regardless of gender or background. James surprised them all by becoming a talented musician, playing piano in the saloons and dance halls, bringing beauty to places that desperately needed it. Adelaide and Xander grew older together, their hair turning gray, their bodies moving slower, but their love remained as strong as it had been that first night. They still talked for hours on their porch in the evenings. They still made each other laugh. They still chose each other every day in 1,000 small ways. When they celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary in 1914, surrounded by their children and growing number of grandchildren, Adelaide stood to make a toast. She looked around at the family they had created, at the life they had built from nothing but hope and hard work and a willingness to trust in each other. 30 years ago, I was convinced my life was over, Adelaide said, her voice still strong despite her 73 years. I was alone and afraid and certain that I would never be anything more than what other people decided I should be. And then one night, a cowboy knocked on my door and offered to help me, no questions asked. That simple act of kindness changed everything. It showed me that I did not have to face my problems alone, that there were people in the world who would stand beside me without judgment, that love could be real and lasting and built on a foundation of genuine partnership and respect. She looked at Xander, who sat at the head of the table with tears in his eyes. "You gave me everything, Xander Sinclair. You gave me a family, a home, a life worth living. You saw me at my very worst and decided I was worth saving. I hope you know that you saved me just as much. We saved each other." Xander stood and crossed to her, taking her hands in his just like he had that first night and so many times since. "You were always worth saving, Adelaide. I was just lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time." "You were exactly where you were supposed to be," Adelaide said, and kissed him to the applause and happy tears of their family. They lived many more good years together in Apache Junction, watching their grandchildren grow, seeing Arizona become a state in 1912, adapting to a world that changed faster than they had ever imagined possible. But through it all, they remained constant to each other, partners in every sense of the word. When Xander died peacefully in his sleep in 1921 at the age of 66, Adelaide grieved deeply but without regrets. They had been married 37 years, and every single one of those years had been a gift. She lived 3 more years after him, spending her days painting and telling stories to her great-grandchildren about the Wild West that was slowly disappearing into history. On her deathbed in 1924, surrounded by the family she and Xander had created, Adelaide's last words were about that night in 1883 when a cowboy had knocked on her door and changed her life forever. "I was so scared," she whispered to Clara, who held her hand. "I was scrubbing blood from the kitchen floor, certain I would be caught and hanged. And then he knocked on my door, this stranger who should have run away screaming. But he just rolled up his sleeves and helped me clean. He did not ask why. He did not judge. He just helped. And that made all the difference." Clara squeezed her mother's hand, understanding even though she had never known the full story. "You loved each other very much." "More than I ever thought possible," Adelaide agreed. "Tell your children, tell their children, that love can come from the strangest places. That sometimes the best thing you can do is open the door when someone knocks, even if you are terrified. That kindness and trust can build something beautiful even in the darkest circumstances. Tell them that a life worth living is built on choices, big and small, to be brave and honest and open to possibility." She closed her eyes, peaceful and ready, knowing that she had lived a good life and loved well. And in her last moments, she could have sworn she heard Xander's voice, warm and familiar, asking if she was ready to go. She smiled and said yes, just like she had all those years ago when he had asked if she would marry him. Yes, she had lived a remarkable life. Yes, she had loved and been loved. Yes, it had all been worth it, every moment of fear and joy and everything in between. And yes, she was ready to rest now, knowing that the family she and Xander had built would continue their legacy of kindness and courage in choosing love even when it seemed impossible. The story of Adelaide and Xander became a family legend, passed down through generations with varying levels of detail and accuracy. But the core truth remained constant, that on a hot August night in 1883 in Apache Junction, Arizona, a scared young woman had opened her door to a stranger, and that simple act of desperate trust had blossomed into a love story for the ages. They had built something beautiful from something terrible, had chosen each other against all odds, and had created a life that neither of them could have imagined alone. Their descendants still lived in Apache Junction and across Arizona, carrying forward the values Adelaide and Xander had instilled in their children. Kindness without judgment, help offered freely to those who need it, trust even when it seems risky. Love that is built on genuine partnership and respect rather than societal expectation or convenience. These lessons echoed through the family tree, shaping how great-great-grandchildren approach their own lives and relationships. The old house where Adelaide and Xander had lived still stood on the edge of what had become modern Apache Junction, preserved now as a historical site by their descendants. Tourists occasionally visited, looking at Adelaide's watercolor paintings still hanging on the walls and the simple furniture that the couple had used for decades. The kitchen had been renovated several times over the years, the original floorboards replaced long ago, taking with them any remaining traces of that fateful night. But the story lived on, whispered by tour guides and family members, changed slightly with each telling but maintaining its essential truth. A woman in trouble, a man who helped without asking why, a love that grew from that moment of crisis into something lasting and real. In the end, perhaps that was the most important legacy Adelaide and Xander left behind. Not the businesses they built or the land they acquired, or even the large family they created, but the simple, powerful truth that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is accept help when you need it, and offer help when someone else is struggling. That trust, even when it seems impossible, can lead to extraordinary things. That love built on genuine partnership and mutual respect is worth whatever risks you have to take to find it. Adelaide Evans had been scrubbing bloodstains from her kitchen floor when Xander Sinclair knocked on her door. He helped her clean and did not ask why. And from that moment of darkness and fear, they built a life full of light and love that lasted decades and touched hundreds of lives across generations. It was a simple story in many ways, but it was also profound, a testament to the transformative power of kindness and the enduring strength of love chosen freely between equals. Their grave markers stood side by side in the Apache Junction Cemetery, simple stones with their names and dates and a single shared inscription chosen by their children. They saved each other. It was the truest thing that could be said about Adelaide and Xander Sinclair, summing up their entire remarkable life together in just 4 words. They had saved each other that August night in 1883, and they had continued saving each other day after day, year after year, until death finally parted them. And even then, the love they had built continued on in the family they created and the legacy they left behind.